There is a gate called the Golden Gate in Jerusalem, and it is a very odd gate because gates exist for the purpose of entering and exiting a building or a city that is a walled city. And yet you can see by the picture there, looking at this golden gate, that there's something that is terribly amiss with this gate. It's closed in such a way that it cannot even be opened if you wanted it to. Now, there's a lot of different legends as to why that was the case. It seems that early on the gate was obviously built to be entered, but when Crusaders showed up and began to be a problem, the gate was closed. The Crusaders were able to get in anyway, and they made sure that the gate was open. And then there was Saladin and Suleiman. There was several different leaders that would close the gate again, and then it would be opened again, and they would close it, and finally it just stayed closed. But it is one of those things that makes us realize there are gates that must be guarded, gates that need to be opened at the appropriate time for the appropriate person who is to enter and to be protected against those that should not. Well, I remember as a young child being very excited to be able to hear the door knock, somebody beating on our front door. I grew up in Memphis. I would open the door for anybody at first. Mom and Dad very quickly said, "Look, son, we live in the suburbs and, we haven't had anybody break into our house, but you just can't open the door for everybody." So I learned to run up to the door and try to look out the window, and if I couldn't, or the little piece of glass that was in the top of the door, and if I couldn't see who it was, say, "Who is it? Who's out there?" And they might say, it's somebody in a name that I knew, and then I would open it. If not, I would take off running down the hall, find an adult, say, "Mom, Dad, there's somebody at the door you need to go see." Now, there were friends that I could let in the door, and there's family members and people we knew from church. But I had to learn a very important lesson. That door has a purpose. It protects, it guards, it allows those in who need to be in. But you have to, if you have access to the door and the ability to open it, you must recognize your responsibility to guard the door and to only let those in who should be allowed. Kind of a heady thought as a young boy to think, I'm guarding the house. I'm the picket line. I'm the guard of the gate. There's another way that people could enter into the house, and that was by the phone. Now, back in those days, no cell phones. Typically, it seemed like most of my friends' houses were the same. We had two different phones connected to one phone line, and when it rang, you ran to figure out who is it that's trying to make access into our house. At first, I would answer and, probably give too much information. So Mom and Dad taught me once again, or maybe my older siblings, you have to say, who is it that's calling? Okay, and if you say, let me go find out, you've told me who it is, go find a parent, go find a sister, whoever it is that would be interested in that phone call, and bring them back. You couldn't just, let anybody enter into the house. You had to take your job seriously. I've been reading about the Revolutionary War and a book, The British is Coming, by Rick Ashley. It's really good. That in the early days of our Continental Army, they had a problem. It was all made up of militias, and these militias didn't know each other. Sometimes they didn't even like each other. And there was always this sense of how do you make sure that the right side is allowing the proper other militia into the camp without letting the British into the camp. And there was this age-old way that you handled that, and that is there's a sign where if you're the guard, you say, "Who goes there? Identify yourself," something like that. And then the countersign would be, the person in the dark who has approached your camp better know the words to say, or else they may get arrested or even killed. And so before the Battle of Trenton, George Washington was just firing these sign countersigns out by the hundreds. It took a while before they could build a real Continental Army that actually had the means of organizing itself, and he was getting exhausted. But before the Battle of Trenton, for reasons that aren't exactly clear to the historians, he came up with a countersign when asked, who goes there? The answer was to be victory or death. Wow, that's kind of a sobering thing. But once again, it matters who enters the camp. It matters who comes through the gate. It matters who enters the door. And so we're going to be looking at Psalm 24, and I thought it's kind of interesting to note that there is a psalm just before it that we all know really well. I dare say that if we were to begin quoting it, at least 3/4 of you, if not the whole group, we could walk through from memory Psalm 23. Psalm 24, probably none of us have put to memory. So I'm going to sort of add an additional piece to a knowledge that you already have, tack on to the song that comes next. And I find them to be very interesting in contrast because David wrote both of them. David wrote about half of the Psalms, but both of those are written by David. But they're so very different when you're thinking through Psalm 23. In fact, Psalm 23 is so familiar. I remember when I was in West Virginia getting called by the funeral home director who went to church with us, and he said, there's a group here that they don't have a preacher, they don't have any idea what to do for the funeral. Can you just come down here and do kind of a generic funeral? And I went down there, and I could tell that there were 7 people there. Looked like they probably hadn't been in church ever, but they understood there was a need for a preacher in this moment. And I was talking, and nobody was looking up, and I started reading out of the NIV, Psalm 23. They started quoting it in the King James. I sort of stepped back. I thought, okay, I learned it in the King James too. So I closed my NIV, and there was a group of people that they didn't have any contact to church, but they knew that message of Psalm 23. It's a beautiful message. It's a pastoral feeling. It's David out there on the Judean countryside, and there's sheep around, and his job is to protect them, but it's beautiful. It's beautiful because he is awake and alert, and he's strong, and he's capable, and he's looking after those sheep, and he begins to reflect on how God does that very thing for us in our lives. When I go through Psalm 23, I kind of hear beautiful wedding music. Pachelbel's Canon in D, those floating, airy, very, very beautiful and calm kind of feel. Psalm 24 is a much older David, I believe. I think it's coming from the time that he's no longer in the fields, but he's in the castle. He's the king who is now in charge of men. He has been to battle. He has known what it is to fight, to kill, to be fearful for his life. Would he survive the next battle? And the sounds of Psalm 24, instead of being that very pastoral and calm and assuring and protective, it's more one of the sound of war. God is at war. God is coming to the gates. People are guarding those gates, and they're not sure that they want to let God in. And God is saying, don't you recognize who I am? Or at least the crier that's going before him is saying, let the God of glory in. And the people are pushing back and saying, we're not sure. It's a royal psalm, a kingly psalm. It's also one that has to do with law. God's rules. He tells us how to live. He expects us to understand that and to recognize that. And so there is in Psalm 24 a very different sound, and I want to read it for us, and then we'll talk a little further. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. Who shall ascend to the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift himself up his soul to what is false, and does not swear deceitfully. He will receive blessings from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek the face of the God of Jacob. And then you hear the cry at the gate, "Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in." And at this point, I can envision a big leather-gloved warrior hand coming up to the gate, and on behalf of the Ark of the Covenant, beating on the gate saying, "Let the King of glory in." Well, from the other side, there is the call for the countersign. Who are you? Who is the King of glory? The question hangs out there, and down from below comes the answer, "The Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle." Then there is silence. There's silence because clearly the people on the gate have refused to open the doors of the gate. And then verse 9, you hear the repeated call from below, "Lift up your heads, O gates, and lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in." Once again from the top, you hear this skeptical question calling for the countersign again. Who is this King of glory? And down below we hear one more time, "The Lord of hosts, he is the King of glory." The word, the Lord of hosts, it's one of those that always kind of left me thinking, okay, we're just talking about a group of people, a crowd, a group that's walking along with somebody. But I like the way Eugene Peterson chose to translate that in his translation of the Bible, The Message, where when he gets to the Lord of hosts, he'll say, "the God of angel armies." Because that's what the statement means. The statement means the God who comes in with a host of an army behind him, surrounding him, listening for his instructions. It is an amazing and a powerful moment that happens. Well, what is the context for the writing of this particular psalm? What would have caused David to say, I need to pen this? There's been speculations because the Ark of the Covenant seems to be the object, symbolizing for all of Israel's history, the presence of God. The Lord God meets his people in this very special box designed according to his specifications, given to Moses, to skilled craftsmen, and there at Mount Sinai, as they crafted all of the tabernacle, inside of the Holy of Holies was this special place, this box. And the high priest could go in and could meet with the Lord and the Lord with him. And the high priest, would stand in behalf of all of the people of God there in the tribes of Israel. And he would listen and he would take instruction from God, the Holy One. So, some have wondered, is it the Ark of the Covenant when it was returning from Philistine captivity, when mistakenly the sons of Eli had carried the ark out to battle, thinking that their disobedience to God could be countermanded by the presence of God's ark, only to find out that a great defeat occurred that day. The Ark of the Covenant was taken, and it later would be returned because the Philistines learned, do not put the Holy One in your temple of your God, because bad things happen to the temple of your God. And the when the ark is brought back, the Philistines say, we just cannot keep this. We're going to find 2 cows that have calves, and we're going to yoke them and see if they will leave their calves to bring back this ark. And they do. They bring it to Bet Shemesh, where Israelites see their ark just coming back with an unmanned cart, and they know it's got to be the hand of God. But in a manner which was inconsistent with how they had been taught to come into the presence of the holy, they crawl up on the ark and they open it up and they look inside. And that day in that small village of Bet Shemesh, 70 men die. And the statement that goes up is, who is able to stand before the Lord, this holy God? They woke up and they realized God is powerful. God is awesome. He is loving and gentle and kind, just like Psalm 23, David's expressions in it. But Psalm 24 speaks of a God who is powerful and mighty and will not be treated lightly or profanely. Problem with that being the context exactly is David hasn't been born. He could be thinking back on this event and writing this psalm, but maybe not. It could be that when David brought the ark up to Jerusalem, now it was brought to the temple at one point, but David was not even alive in those days, so it couldn't be David recounting the memory of it coming to the temple. But there was the moment where, after the ark had been moved, it then was brought, and there in the city, the ark is brought in, and you remember that famous scene with Uzzah, who reaches up and he's going to steady the ark because he's fearful that the ox cart, which is not the way to transport the Ark of the Covenant, has had something happen, and the ark is going to tip over, he feels like, and he touches it and he dies. And once again, there is this statement, how can the ark of the Lord come to me, that comes out of David, because he has learned the same thing the men of Bet Shemesh learned. You are not caring for God. God, a holy God, stands in your presence and can do more than you can ask or imagine, and he expects your respect. He expects you to realize who he is and how it is that you are to come before him. Let's go 4 centuries into the future from the time of David. There is something that happens to Israel that they just never thought God would actually do it. That was, they got sent into captivity. Now, there had been descendants of David, about 22 kings, or give or take a king, that had, down through the ages, an heir of David, part of the dynasty of David, that had ruled at least in the southern half of the kingdom of Israel, if not the whole thing. And these kings thought, no matter what they did, some of them good, some bad, that God would always be on their side, always protect them, always do what they needed him to do, to step in, save the day, and they could, like I say, do sort of what they wanted because they were kings, and that's what people tell kings. You're the king, you make up the rules. Well, they got into Babylonian captivity. God called Babylon to come and to carry off his people to Babylon. And he made it very clear. The prophets could not have spelled it out more plainly. You're not being taken really by the king of Babylon. You're being sent by God, who has called for and summoned the king of Babylon to come and to take you into captivity. And there in a foreign land, for the first time, they have to deal with a problem of, we are in a land that is not God's gift to us, the promised land. We have to figure out how to worship God, to help our children to stay faithful, because we don't know how long we're going to be here. And the local culture could easily absorb us and pull us in, and we could find ourselves a generation or two from extinction, at least spiritually. Well, there's something interesting that happened in the Jewish community, and there was a tradition that was started. You see, the way the pagans in Babylon would make sure their people stay focused on their gods is they assigned a god to each day. And each day you would make that god, this is his day or her day, and they would hold them up and say, they're the ones, they are the ones that we worship and care for us and protect us. And somehow or another, the leaders of Israel, it seems, determined we're going to meet this with in a manner that keeps our focus and our children's focus upon the Lord God of Israel. Now, you may think that's kind of strange, but I thought, I should just sort of show you how it happens that even our calendar is one that it doesn't threaten. I don't think it threatens to sweep us away into paganism, but it's kind of interesting how Sunday is, well, you worship the sun. Monday, worship the moon. Tuesday, worship a Nordic god called TIW. Or Wednesday's Woden's Day. Thursday is Thor's Day. Friday is the wife of Thor. And then Saturday is for Saturn. And, it's something that has happened in places everywhere for all time. We have sort of almost just sort of passed it out of being a problem. The things in our culture are much more severe, and I'm not concerned at addressing our calendar as much as making sure that we are checking where our children are getting their information, where they're getting their understanding of what is good and proper and should fill their heads. These things we do need to care for, and just like those Jewish leaders, we need to find a way to bring God in the gates and to keep the other things of this world, the false gods, out. So what did the Jews do? Well, they decided that in their little gatherings that would later become the origin of synagogues, they would get together and they would have a psalm for the day. And each day of the week, there were 7 psalms that they picked. And you wonder, how do you reach into 150 psalms and pick the 7 that you're going to say, these are going to be the 7 that are going to define us, protect us, guide our children, and allow our families to stay on track with God? Well, guess which one got to be the first day of the week? Psalm 24. You'd have thought it'd been Psalm 23, right? Everybody knows Psalm 23. It didn't make the top 7. I don't understand exactly how that all worked out. If you're wondering, ask Nathan. He can explain all of that to you. But Psalm 24 was one that on the first day of the week, you had a gathering of people saying, who's coming into your gates? Do you know who is the God who is over all things? Do you recognize who created the heavens and the earth? And whatever it is the captors are telling you, whatever the nation who now orders you around and dictates whatever your day is going to be about, you need to recognize what the truth is. And so verses 1 and 2 of Psalm 24 say, get your eyes on the great King. Recognize that the Lord holds title over all the earth. And not only over all the earth, everything that's in it, everyone that is on it. They do not exist but what God has allowed that to happen, and they are not able to live one moment without God providing that. Do you hear how significant that is to captives or to people who feel a bit overwhelmed, maybe like we, by culture that is making inroads into our lives, into our faith, and into how our children think and live? It's important to recognize that there is chaos in this world. You don't do yourself a favor or your children by pretending and never acknowledging that there are things in this world that shake us to our very foundations. But what the answer from Scripture and the answer from Psalm 24 specifically is you need to recognize that when you come up against these terrible things in life, be it illness or death or loss of job or relocation or things that just really shake you, rattle you, do you realize that God is over it all? It's kind of chaotic to be on a river that is really wild. If you've had the chance to be in a canoe on a rough river, it'll make you a person of faith. If you've ever been in a raft on a really bad river, it will make you a sober person of faith. You will pray, I guarantee it. If you're like me and you end up being told you can get out of the raft, but then the next person jumps on you and shoves you under the water, and the next person shoves you under the water, and then you get under the raft for a while, and when you come out, the guy at the back has to pick you up and set you on the side of the raft and get water out of you. You begin to realize there's chaos in some places in this life, and it may not be a watery experience that you have, but there are things of this world that rattle us, that shake us. And even those things God has made and God controls. Do you see the assurance that begins to move into our hearts? Do you see what it is that begins to calm us? We don't have to downplay the danger. We have to once again lift up our eyes and see that the Lord of heaven and earth is the one who is bigger, and he can make a storm and he can break a storm. Just look at what Jesus did in a little bitty boat on a sea when seasoned fishermen were sure they were certain to die that night, and with just a word, a rebuke, the storm was gone. Riding out a storm is kind of a scary thing. My family was on a trip up through the Dakotas when I was about 10 years old. My two sisters, mom and dad. No, Bruce, you want to know if Bruce was there? No, he wasn't. He was grown and had a job, summer job. But we were in the Dakotas, and the first night we were up in the eastern side of North Dakota, and we were in a KOA campground, and we had a pop-up camper, and a bunch of other people did, and there were several pop-up campers that got flipped over that afternoon. It was scary. Never seen anything like that. Well, we figured we had lived through a terrible evening. We went across the Dakotas, and there in a little place called Strasburg, home of Lawrence Welk, and there was nobody else there. Well, Lawrence Welk wasn't there either, but it was like the Dakotas, pretty wide open landscape, no trees. There we were camped beside a lake. A storm came that night like I had never and have not since ever seen. We were in that little camper, and those pop-out beds were flapping like a bird's wings. The poles had popped out. They were flapping up and down. The fabric that you tuck into the door, the aluminum trim to be able to seal it when you put it up, blown out. The camper was moved sideways, and even with the feet and those big metal feet that balance it and level it, it was a horrible, horrible night. We lived through it. The next morning, we were standing around and we were just in shock, and Mom said, "Durley, I know where you were at." And Karen and Kim, "I know where you were at." "Carl, where were you at?" I said, "Mom, I was in your lap." When you're that scared, when you think that you're about to die, it is an overwhelming feeling. And we will all have moments like that of some kind or another. It may be finances that rise and then plummet. It might be any way that we think we have structured our world and protected ourselves and established ourselves, only to find out that we're building houses of sand. It is God that is forever, and we hold to him. When we stand alone, we find ourselves shaken. It was into a world of that kind of people being shaken down to their core and beginning to even wonder if there was anything of assurance in this world that caused two men in the early part, just after World War I, early in last century, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. They didn't set out to write fantasy just because they liked fantasy. They didn't set out to write about the stories just because it seemed like an interesting, catchy plot line. They were men that were trying to figure out how do you, once again, bring a world that has been shaken by governments going places you never thought, armies doing destruction like you never imagined. The world that you've known has been turned upside down and you feel more helpless than you ever have before. And in those stories, that maybe we read them at bedtime to our kids, maybe we read it to ourselves for entertainment, but what they're drawing us into is the same idea of, can you see that there is something bigger at work in this world than just the politics and the armies and the financial institutions and all the things that would cause us to tremble? You want assurance? Look above and see what it is that God is doing. Verses 3-6, the hill of the Lord. Once we see the vision of the Holy One, the glory of God, now we're shaken by the fact of, but I can't stand here. I will surely die. Look what happened to Uzzah. Look what has happened to other people. The question has to be asked, who can ascend to the hill of the Lord and stand in his holy presence? Moses and Israel was wondering the same thing when they came out of the land of Egypt. This holy God had taken the greatest empire in the world, Egypt, their Pharaoh, their armies, their economy, and broken it in a very short period of time. Even their army that was sent out to try to stop them at the Red Sea, destroyed completely. And then before the mountain of the Lord, Mount Sinai, they could not help but continually wrestle with the question, who are we to be standing here this close to a holy God? It's a question that if our eyes are open, we're going to ask at some time or another. But see, here's the beautiful answer that comes back. It is the one who lives the sanctified life. The one who recognizes that God is asking for purity, devotion, to stay away from idolatry because it's false. It's deadly, it's sick. We tend to think, no. When you're trying to stand before someone who's great and you're trying to make sure that that person will receive you, it would be because you're mighty, your deeds are great, because maybe you've accomplished something that is marvelous, or you're beautiful and intellectual. And no. Standards that we make that are false standards. Who can stand in the presence of the holy God? Who can ascend to the hill of the Lord and stand there? It is the person who humbly comes and submits to God and says, you are God and there is no other. And so the instruction is seek him. Seek the face of the God of Jacob. If you like the Indiana Jones series, the old one, those three movies, the third one, Indiana Jones and his dad are looking for the Holy Grail, and they keep thinking, we've got to get to that place, and there's these three challenges that we have to get through when we get there, but they're also racing against a bunch of really bad people, and the bad people are all thinking, there's three challenges, and the way you win it is by force, by strength, by might. But the statement is, only the penitent will pass. I think that George Lucas hit the right idea, you know? It's the person on their knees, the person who bows before the Lord God and none other. that finds themselves able to be unbelievably in the presence of the holy. And then the last verses 7 to 10, the divine warrior, the shouting at the gate, the request to open the gate, to allow God to come in. And yet there is this hesitancy on the part of the person standing on the wall to let him in. And by this time, we've sung the song, and so we get to this point and we think, surely when they say, who's the King of glory? And the word comes back, the Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle, the gates will fly open and the confetti will begin to go forth and the parade will commence, because this is who we've been waiting for. This is the longing of our hearts, the salvation of God. But instead, in the song, there is silence. I don't know why David has that in there. I mean, there's no cue that says, pause here for silent pause. But the question was asked, the answer, the countersign was given, and there is every reason to think that the gates would break open. But instead, it has to be asked a second time in verse 9. And I wonder why. Is it for effect that the same question must be asked one more time and the answer has to be given one more time and the response is given with really no suggestion as to which way the person behind the gate chose to conclude the song? Maybe it's left for you and I to close the song ourselves. Do we say yes or do we say no? What is it that we say? It's interesting that when Jesus came into Jerusalem, and people have speculated about this, and they don't really know, but was that tradition of Psalm 24 being the psalm that would be read on Sunday, the first day of the week? Was it being read in Jerusalem in the temple when Jesus came humbly riding on a donkey, and a few people were recognizing the event and shouting, Hosanna in the highest, but so many others, it seems, did not know, did not care, did not believe? Was that happening on the day that Christ showed up on that long trip from Galilee down to Jericho and up to Jerusalem and entered into the city of God, the one that was the very center of their religious experience? And there he has come to sit upon the throne, and he is received by a few but rejected by most. In Revelation, there's a statement. You can find similar type statements, but this is the one that we probably remember the most, where we hear the churches of Asia who are wrestling with, who are we as Christians living in a pagan land? How do we possibly sustain our faith in Jesus as Lord when there is so much pressure from Caesar and everybody that's under him to crush any kind of loyalty that would be other than Rome? And the answer is to listen. Listen to the voice of God. Listen to, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him and he with me. The people of the time of John were struggling and wrestling with it. You and I hope, will not just drift in the stream, in the river of culture. That we will not just throw open the doors to anything and everything that says, look at me, follow me, believe in me, but be people who ask the question, and when the answer is given, we say, yes, Lord, come in. We confess. We choose to be baptized into your name, to be raised, filled with the Spirit of God, commissioned on the task of going forth and to share that with others as disciples that walk in step with Jesus.
Worship me,